I'm Laura Sims, Relationship Director at Barclays, and delighted today to be moderating the Macro View of Uncertainty session for BAFT 2025 Global Annual Meeting. This is a timely conversation for every one of us in this room as we continue to both professionally and personally navigate a period of heightened uncertainty and complexity in global markets. From geopolitical tensions, the heightened need to recalibrate supply chains and economic instability, the macro backdrop today is anything but predictable. The goal of this session is to take a pause from the noise, explore in more detail the drivers to these changes, the potential outcomes, and everything in between. I'm joined today on stage by Barclays Global Head of Policy Advisory, Shawn, and Chad Ramey, BNP's Head of Washington, D.C. office. So Shawn, Chad, thank you again for joining us on the stage and bringing to the audience what you are hearing and seeing directly on the Capitol and how the current volatility and uncertainty may evolve. So we've got a number of questions. We are going to try and leave some time for Q&A at the end, so please do submit your questions to us. We'll try and get to them, but we've got a lot to pack in, so we'll carry on. So Chad, starting with you and bringing it back to basics, can you kick us off with just a current line of the land for the US tariffs? Perhaps before even getting to where we are today, breaking down for us the point of the tariff changes which were implied on April 2nd, and what is the end goal of the current administration?
Yeah. First, thank you for having me. That's a lot, but the end goal, start with that, is to reindustrialize the United States and realign trading partnerships around the world by knocking down trade barriers, both non-tariff and tariff barriers with U.S. trading partners. There is also a goal to raise revenue, and that's, this. People always talk about how can you do all three? If you're doing one, then you can't do the other. The way we look at tariffs and how they're utilized from the administration is kind of three buckets. The first bucket are sectoral tariffs. These are designed to be on for the long term. So think about steel and aluminum, automobiles, potentially tariffs on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. The president uses long-standing existing authority to put these tariffs in place, and they require examinations, investigations, and reporting. So they put a lot of work on the front end to put these in place. So we expect them to remain in place for probably, if it were up to him, probably the rest of his presidency and beyond. After that, you have reciprocal tariffs, which we all hear about. Now, these are designed to be, quick on, quick off if necessary. These are negotiating tools to knock down, foreign trading partners' trade barriers, as the president calls it. The third is similar to reciprocal tariffs, but the best way for me to describe it is like a hammer, right? A weapon basically to dictate or change the non-trade behaviors of our trading partners. So an example of this is fentanyl tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. These are not trade issues, but we're using a tariff to get them to address their border security. Another example would be when the president attempted to deport some migrants to Colombia. This is a few months ago, and the Colombian president refused to accept them. He immediately announced large tariffs. The president of Colombia relented and actually, and accepted the migrants. So he's using tariffs in different ways, in different tariffs. So the reciprocal and the hammer tariffs, as I call them. He's using IEEPA, which is it's a newly used authority that not everybody in the legal community agrees is the appropriate way to be used on tariffs, but he's using those so that he can do them quickly. As I said, on quickly, off quickly. He's using longstanding tariff authority to put in place sectoral tariffs that, again, we expect to be on for the long term. So long-term tariffs create the reindustrialization. That's the goal here, is that it creates the reindustrialization that the president is looking for. Reciprocal tariffs knock down those trade barriers, and they are the negotiating tactic. Where we end up in July after the pause on reciprocal tariffs, that's I don't know, right? I can't make that prediction, but we do know that the White House is right now, trying to basically negotiate deals with a handful of countries every 2 weeks and get to, 18 deals done by July. I don't know that that's realistic, to be honest with you. I don't know that the White House necessarily thinks it's realistic, but I do think that they believe they can get something in place with many of the Asian countries and some of our larger trading partners.
Great, thank you. Shawn, over to you. Every day we're hearing about the threats to inflation, rate policies and unemployment due to the revised tariffs, but do you think you could just speak clearly and as candidly as you can in your role to the direct implications of the potential trade tariffs which may be coming to us in July?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. So where I sit on the investment banking side, seeing our corporate clients and institutional investors, and I think if I were to map what's happening from what Chad had said, you have a incredible amount of economic uncertainty. We all see this, so this is not new, but to put data behind this, like the volatility indices that the Fed and others use, it's now at points exceeded what we saw in the great financial crisis and in COVID, which is a bit surprising, and how sudden it's been, because we've known tariffs were going to be coming for a long time. President Trump, as a candidate, kept talking about it. So it goes back to this phrase for those in Washington, this like, do you take him serious or take him literal? And in 2016, many of us said, just take him serious, but don't take him literal. This time, take him very literally as to what he's going to do, and then add a little to it, because he campaigned on 60% tariffs on China, and now we're at 145. So you ended up with this economic uncertainty getting really high, which now is beginning to actually hit the financial markets. And remember, what is today? May 5th. It's been a little over a month since the announcement of Liberation Day. The effective date was April 9th. So we're living in like this real-time data release mode right now, where it's a bit of a gray area. But what we've seen thus far is consumer sentiment dropping to quite dramatically. We've seen inflation just beginning to pick up, but what you should watch is like the 1-year inflation expectations, or the Fed likes the 5-10-year inflation expectations, both of which you have this elevated part of the curve now that we just never saw. And in the entire run-up of inflation that we've seen in the last 2 years under President Biden, you never had expectations this high. So what does that mean? That means consumers early went out and they bought lots of stuff. I always joke, I moved from New York to the suburbs outside of DC, and as any good suburbanite, you often go to Costco. So my joke is you go to Costco, you buy all the Prosecco you can buy ahead of time before those tariffs start to hit. But you see this with small businesses buying lots of stuff to build up inventory. Now what's happening is those consumers are beginning to peel back, and they're seeing these higher prices come into play. Go through grocery stores. I was at a Wegmans the other day, and they put up signs about tariff increases on agricultural products. I don't think I've ever seen such a thing. And consumers now are beginning to discuss it. What we also see now is the growth in GDP forecasts. At Barclays, we're projecting on our research side a mild recession at the second half of this year and growth resuming in 26. But let's be honest, this is a bit of a knob, and President Trump is turning this knob on tariffs to deciding how much, economic pain we're willing to take. What we saw was on Liberation Day's effective date, the U.S. is only willing to take so much economic pain. He then paused on those reciprocal tariffs, as Chad mentioned. Why did he do that? Well, for many of us, myself included, we still believe there is a bit of a Trump put. In other words, there's only so much economic pain he's willing to take. And what did we see that day? We saw equity sell off. We saw unusually bond sell off and the dollar. Those are very unusual moments. And for all of you, all of us in the financial services sector, I think there was a lot of alarm bells beginning to go off. On the issue on yields, the 10-year hit 4.5, the 30-year hit 5%. That might be the Trump put. It's getting a really high interest rate on 10-year debt, which then impacts consumer products like mortgages and autos and other things. But also, very importantly, we're printing bonds to pay for bonds. We had a $1.8 trillion deficit, 6.4% of GDP. I don't see that going down anytime soon, no matter what people might say. And if you're printing bonds at 4.5% on the 10-year, that's very problematic. You're going to have an enormous interest expense consuming the federal budget, which is already quite high. What we see going forward now is watch the labor market. We haven't seen these layoffs pick up, and we had a good print, I think, on Friday last week. On the labor side, we at Barclays think the unemployment rate gets to about 4.6, maybe slightly higher by the end of the year. But again, there's a big asterisk on those numbers as we begin to see how long these tariffs are in play. But we're watching that in real time. If we see the labor market erode and deteriorate, and we see unemployment get higher, what is a mild, shallow recession could become a lot greater. If we see inflation pick up to close to 4% while unemployment gets higher, we will see the stagflation environment that some of us talk about. This has been a topic, I think, with investors and corporates that, let's say 2 months ago wasn't really top of mind, but has absolutely become like a central theme of each conversation in each meeting. And then lastly, because there's a lot of foreign clients here as well, international banks, us included at BNP and at Barclays, this sell American narrative is now picking up. I don't know how much this can run with, but it is interesting that I've been doing this for a long time, 20 years at the bank. I've never seen financial participants talking about a sell U.S. narrative of like the durability of American exceptionalism. That's always been an issue with my friends at the Department of Defense or at CIA and in intelligence circles. That's never been a financial topic or like really considered. But now we see this, much more often. And I think this is quite a dangerous brew that we have right now in terms of how we see it from a risk perspective. Just one last thing is going forward, I am actually kind of optimistic. I think we're going to see a lot of trade deals. These are not going to be FTAs or free trade agreements. These are going to be effectively like term sheets or MOUs. And the administration off the record has said a lot of this stuff. So, you can't negotiate, let's be honest, a free trade agreement in 90 days. That's just, I don't care how brilliant you are. That's just not possible. The reality is you're going to probably come out with some sort of MOU or term sheet that outlines the parameters. We're hoping, from a market's perspective, we can take the temperature down. And on some areas, it's easy. US, Korea, very easy. We already have 0% tariffs. They have 0% on us. We have a free trade agreement. Let's minimize some of the other issues and find ways for the South Koreans to buy more American product. USMCA, our number one trading partner, our number one trading group, our number one place for exports from the US is Canada. That's incredibly important. Think autos that go over the border 5, 6, 7 times. We've got to find some resolution. We have a very expansive trade agreement. They need to update that. Let's just hope they can lower the temperature on rates. Clearly, China is the big sort of elephant in the room, so to speak, and I don't expect tariffs to ever get down to where they were, and I think the markets are a bit mispricing and should expect to have these tariffs a lot higher for the long term. But for all of us, we don't know if that's going to be 60% on what he campaigned on, 100%. I know from our Barclays side, on the research side, they modeled a 30% tariff before the election, and that was sort of the baseline. They just didn't expect it to get as high as it did.
Okay. So I suppose staying on the level of optimism, turning it maybe slightly to taxes and the reform that we're waiting to hear from imminently. We actually thought that we might have actually heard more on the weekend or starting off today, but just some thoughts around that, and more generally on taxes as well, what we can expect over, this administration and imminently, as I mentioned. Maybe Shawn, yourself to kick off with us.
And I'd love to hear from Chad, having worked on the Capitol Hill for so long. There's a lot of things that are going to come out of this, and I think, as we see this, stickier tariffs for the long term, I mean, Congress is extra incentivized to get a tax reform deal done. And again, through budget reconciliation, I'm sure many of you have heard through it, and know this process. I think for Republicans in Congress, seeing how it played out in Trump's first term, they waited too long on tax reform to see the benefits. Given the degradation in growth from trade, they're going to want to put some pro-growth policy, and I think tax reform is that potential opportunity. I think from a corporate perspective, there's been a lot of talk about lowering that corporate rate. I hear a lot less talk about that today. Talk about the R&D expense component and changing how they think about that. That's been something I think quite notable for our corporate client base. But one thing to note, I think bigger picture is this really going to lower the deficit? Like, are we going to have a situation where it's paid for? And again, I'd love to hear Chad's take on this. There's this sort of debate brewing in Washington where they would continue the current policy and essentially account that over the next 10 years, there's no cost to extending tax cuts. I mean, I'm being a little, concise in how I'm explaining it, but the reality is the bond markets are going to see right through that. And if we're running a $1.8 trillion deficit with a sub 4.5% unemployment, and unemployment's expected to go up, the deficit's expected to go up as well. And you're going to see a slightly higher deficit going forward. And I think for the bond markets, it's going to be about absorbing what will be like a $2+ trillion annual deficit going forward. because I don't see a lot of discussion about grand entitlement reform and other things. But I do know that for Congress, they don't want to see their taxes go up. In terms of timing, it's been Memorial Day has been talked about a lot from members of Congress. I'm skeptical. I'm thinking, end of July before their August recess. If there's one thing Congress likes, summer vacation would be one of those things, and not ruining that August recess. I also think that's a good break. But if they can't get it done, I guess they could do it in Q4. But if I were looking at it from at least a corporate perspective and how clients see it, they're expecting this deal to go through. So in the event they don't get a tax reform deal through reconciliation, for whatever reason, I think that would be quite a big shock to the system.
Okay. And Chad, any additional thoughts from yourself?
Yep. I largely agree with all of that. As tariffs are kind of dominating the conversation with the administration, tax reform dominates the conversation on Capitol Hill. It's the number one legislative priority, and they're working their way through it. I'll just be very quick here. The reconciliation process requires the House and Senate to agree to top-line numbers. Once they agree to that, then they begin to reconcile those numbers and write a bill that will be the tax reform bill. They have agreed to those top-line numbers. Their goal here is to extend the portions of the 2017 tax bill that are expiring at the end of this year. So I guess if there is a hard deadline, it is the end of this year. To extend them or make them permanent, it will cost $4.7 trillion, as you were talking about, for deficits. However, the way their budget is written, they say that they're maintaining level spending, current spending levels, so that costs zero. So the budget calls for maintaining current levels, plus an additional $1.5 trillion in cuts, and further cuts, tax cuts, that is. On top of that, it is not necessarily written into the budget, but the congressional leadership have said that they will put in place $1.5 trillion in spending cuts to current spending levels. They're going to have a very difficult time finding $1.5 trillion in spending cuts because they are not talking about entitlement reform. They largely are going to have to target the Medicaid program, which could be considered entitlement reform, but this is the discretionary side. And if the House's bill were to go through, that they're going to probably mark up this week, we're talking about hundreds of billions, upwards of $800 billion of cuts to Medicaid. I don't know that they have the votes for that on the Republican side. I really don't think they have the votes for that on the Republican side in the Senate. I'm not sure they have it in the House. That's not to say they're not going to get this done, but they're going to have a very tough time. So they need to extend just to avoid a tax increase. But on top of that, if we're going to have some stimulus out of it, they need further cuts, which is going to raise that price tag as well. The president has talked about it a lot, about no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. He's talked about what he calls 100% expensing, bonus depreciation, an additional domestic manufacturing tax credit of some sort. So he also talked about last week being able to expense or get a tax credit for interest payments on domestically made automobiles. The president walked out of a meeting with congressional leaders right before he said all of those things at the microphone, so I assumed that they're going to be in the House bill. I was actually worried that the House bill was going to be introduced this morning right before this, and you were going to ask me questions about it, and I was just going to walk off the stage. But we do think that we'll see a draft, at least, of the House tax plan this week. They're planning on having the Ways and Means Committee mark it up this week. As far as the cuts go, that's the Energy and Commerce Committee. The Medicaid cuts that we're talking about, also probably some Inflation Reduction Act cuts. We should see that this week. The plan is to see that this week as well. However, again, they're having a very difficult time with that right now. I will say one thing for timing. I don't want to take up too much time here. The Speaker said they want to do it before Memorial Day. The Senate Majority Leader has not really given a hard deadline. They would like to get it done before August recess. They can certainly do that. They can certainly do that. I worked on Capitol for 15 years, though, and if something expired on December 31st, we didn't fix it 6 months in advance, 4 months in advance, right? We fixed it 15 minutes in advance. I think this could be a late year exercise is what I'm getting at. But that is based on just experience, not on anything that I'm being told from Capitol Hill.
That's why you're here, Chad, so thank you. And I'm really conscious of time, as you can see. We've got more questions coming in as well. But there was just one more that we wanted to make sure that we captured, and we're really going across pillars of conversation in a compact 30 minutes. But One, I think more so for the audience as well, is around regulations or deregulations of banks as well under the current administration. There's some views that it may be easier to go through M&A, like if you're going to go through with an acquisition, then maybe this administration is your time to do so. But we'll just welcome your thoughts there, and maybe just to keep it snappy, just 3 areas which you think the banks may be focusing on when it comes to, or their priorities when it comes to the deregulation.
So I don't know necessarily what each individual bank wants, or I think it kind of varies. But if you're talking about Fed-regulated banks, I think what we're expecting to see from the Fed is a change to the supplemental leverage ratio, probably this year. There is talk about stress testing reform. I know soon-to-be Vice Chair of Supervision, Michelle Bowman, has spoken about both of those. And of course, some certainty around Basel III capital standards would be welcome, not only for domestic banks, but particularly for foreign banks who operate under different jurisdictions as well. So those are the 3 things we expect to see this year, maybe Basel into next year when it comes to reform. Of course, there will already be significant changes to the SEC's treatment of crypto. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. They'll probably do that with Congress. It's going to take some law changes, but some sort of marketplace for cryptocurrency and legislation around stablecoin is probably coming as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shawn, anything to add on that?
No, I think he hit all the points. I think, if you don't tax tips, I think as bankers, we're going to be pulling out our iPhones at the end of meetings with a 15, 18, or 20% tip, asking our clients to start tipping us, because I think there's going to be a lot of leakage in tax payments. That's going to be a problem. And if you don't tax Social Security benefits, you're going to have an issue where the Social Security Trust Fund, which is currently projected to go insolvent, I want to say in like 36 or so, 2030, and it's always changing. That's going to be a lot sooner. There is some benefit to like a deadline of an entitlement reform actually being an insolvency and having trouble, because it will force Washington and policymakers to deal with it. But there's a really big risk that would be actually staring at that edge where the U.S. would have a really big fiscal problem.
Again, we've got a number of questions that have come through, and some of them are quite pertinent, obviously, to what we're talking through. But maybe one that I can see quite clearly is, what level of growth does the US need to achieve in order to reduce the budget deficit? Is that something that we can easily answer?
Well, generally the idea is to get the budget deficit less than 3% of GDP. That's always been the sort of standard, and that's like a long-running standard for a long time. And for the US, we often do reduce, we have these recessions, so Great Financial Recession in 2009, deficits hit, I think, 9 and 10% of GDP, and then they slowly began to decrease over time, thereby hitting less than 3%, and then we had COVID, and then we expanded to something like 15 or 12% of GDP deficits, huge. And now we're at a pretty dangerous run rate of north of 6%. So, if you're going to achieve economic growth, and usually in the US, we don't get, 4 or 5% economic growth does not happen. I mean, year over year, no. I mean, you're not talking about like in the 2s, and 3% is a pretty amazing, I think, situation. Historically, we've had those moments, and some people will look at issues like, is AI going to be this tremendous productive tool that's going to get us there? But, highly, I discount that prospect. It's going to be amazing, but I don't think it's going to produce that kind of economic growth. I just think for Congress and for Washington, the general notion is getting deficits to a more reasonable level, and reasonable is often thought of as less than 3% of GDP.
One of the questions which is quite popular here is that you mentioned there will be some tariffs at stick. Are you worried about a longer-term economic impact from tariffs on products like steel and aluminium? Sorry if I offended anyone for how I say aluminium there. And cars, or can the financial market adjust to these tariffs?
Chad, you want to take it?
You'd be better off talking about how the financial markets will adjust. But, as I said, there's a true belief in the Trump administration that these are going to reindustrialize the United States. And there's a certain amount of pain that they're willing to take in certain areas. They will be much more likely to adjust the reciprocal tariffs than they will to adjust these. They did make an adjustment to automobiles. Mm-hmm. But again, this is long-standing legal authority they have to do this. They put a lot of work on the front end to do it. and they expect to keep them on for the long term. The market, you'd probably be better off.
So he put those tariffs on, I think his feedback loop is what we're still trying to figure out. So in term one, he put these tariffs forward, and there was like not much negative feedback. Like you can go through the data and like US washer machines, the price went up from inflation, fine. But in general, the market adjusted and we kind of moved forward. And the downstream impact of higher aluminum and steel, we just kind of worked through. President Biden came in, he didn't get rid of those tariffs. So for President Trump's perspective, it's like, great, the other guy is in power, and he didn't remove those tariffs. In fact, he added to some tariffs. Those were very targeted, semiconductor and other things, but they still added to it. So I think that feedback loop is what's being in process now, and he hasn't seen a dramatic negative impact. Thus far, the dramatic negative impact was implementation day of Liberation Day, that April 9th, when the financial markets effectively seized up and had warning signs flashing. I think aluminum and steel and many of these sort of specific items like that are going to stick around. And I agree with Chad. Some of the, the way they calculated reciprocal tariffs wasn't, as robust of a process as many of us had hoped for. But I think and I'm being polite in how I say this, but on aluminum and steel, I do think likely to stick around. Now, if there's a major negative impact over time, maybe those things get lowered and weakened a bit. Because some things are just not moving back to the U.S. Like this reindustrialize the U.S. 8% of U.S. 8% of U.S. jobs are in manufacturing. It's been 8% for a pretty long time. All right, like it was about 45% pre-World War II. It's just gone on this downward trend since. And the U.S. is effectively becoming a service economy, and that's what we do. And we design the chips. We don't build them here anymore. So you're going to bring some sectors back, I get it, like defense-related or defense-adjacent. And for, I think, the Trump administration, they see steel and aluminum as one of these defense or defense-related industries. And I think some of those jobs will come back, but those tariffs will probably be sticking around.
Okay, and I think we've got time for one more, and an interesting one that caught my eye is, as the US becomes more insular, where will the center of international finance move to? Is that under question, do you think?
I do not think it's into question right now. Under question. So, when you have conversations with members of the administration or of Congress, and you talk about the United States' role internationally, they continue to say that the United States intends on being a leader internationally. They intend on taking part in Basel. They intend on remaining the reserve currency. There's a lot of talk about these things outside, but when the actual Secretary Bessent or anybody else around the White House talks about these things, you get the sense that they do not believe that's a risk and that they will make sure that it doesn't become a risk.
Okay. Shawn, any final thoughts before we close out?
I largely agree. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the U.S. is still the biggest, most significant player. I just think there will be a rise of greater discussion about moving money centers or thinking about financial flows or countries trying to come together. But I think it's going to be quite challenging to replace the U.S. in that sense, especially not in the short term. That's just, I don't think, feasible.
Good. Okay, made a lot of people very happy in the room. So everyone, thank you. Chad, thank you, Shawn, for all your insights today. It's been a great session. Thanks everyone for listening.